possessiveness, stalking, and manipulation. 3 traits that surely should end any relationship. But what do you do if you're unable to escape this very problem? My name is Adrian, and welcome back to another video by Coffeehouse Crime. Today we're looking at the case of Aliny Godinho, her husband Ricardo Godinho, and the evil reign he had over her life. And just a quick heads up, but I post solved, unsolved, and strange cases here on a weekly basis. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing to Coffeehouse Crime. So pull up a seat, grab a coffee, and sit back. This is the case of Aliny Godinho. Our case today will once again take us to England. But first, we must head down to the southern hemisphere, and more specifically, to the colourful country of Brazil. Hosting more than half of the Amazon rainforest, Brazil is also home to one of the most diverse and rich biomes on the planet, thus making it famous for its natural beauty. Like most countries in South America, Brazil does unfortunately have its own catalogue of issues. But that doesn't stop Brazilians being described as some of the warmest and most exuberant people on the planet. People from all over the world visit this country for its world-famous Carnival in Rio, often staying afterwards to enjoy Brazil's wide-open beaches, mountains, and rainforest. And living in the mountainous city of Belo Horizonte, we meet today's couple. Born in the year of 1979, Aliny Mendes grew up as the oldest of 4 siblings within a family that was struggling financially. This meant that Aliny had to grow up fast in order to help her mother with domestic responsibilities, as her father worked pretty much all the time. Aliny's father also suffered with alcoholism, and he would often take his wife out to bars and venues, which, in return, would leave the children all alone to fend for themselves. But being the oldest, Aliny took on a motherly role to her younger siblings. And being in a family plagued through alcoholism, she often took it upon herself to protect her brothers and sister. Fast forward to the year 2001, and Aliny was 22 years old, working in a clothing store to help keep her family afloat. And while working here, she met Ricardo Godinho. He was 24 years old at the time, and he worked in the same store as a delivery boy. The two often met up after work, and over the next 2 years, they became closer, before finally beginning a relationship in 2003. Although Aliny grew up in a problematic house, she was extremely positive and hopeful as a person. And when she fell in love with Ricardo, she looked at her future with him with optimism. Fancying a change, the couple wanted to get away from the Brazilian lifestyle, and instead look elsewhere to a place with greater opportunity for their future. And fortunately, after exploring their possibilities, they found that Ricardo could apply for an Italian passport with thanks to his family roots. And this passport would give the couple access to most of the European Union. The couple had high hopes of settling in England, and more specifically, London. And so, using his connections, Ricardo forged a fake marriage certificate in order to qualify Aliny for migration. Within months, the couple moved to London, becoming known as Mr. and Mrs. Godinho. And soon after arriving, Aliny quickly gained work at a hostel in central London, most likely winning the position due to her kind, warm and welcoming nature. She helped to host many people from all over the world here, and she loved her job. It was in this job that Aliny met Vanessa, and with Vanessa also coming from Brazil, the two quickly formed a strong sister-like friendship, eventually becoming best friends. Moving on 4 years, both Aliny and Ricardo seemed to have settled in the UK relatively well. It was around this time that Aliny felt comfortable and ambitious enough to begin her own business, of course with Ricardo and Vanessa included. Her business idea was simple yet extremely effective. She wanted to bake Brazilian cakes for the London public. She would settle and specialise in birthday cakes, as they were very high in demand in her area. The Godinhos made England their home, and not long after bringing their business into the world, they also welcomed their first child. Aliny was already happy, but becoming a mother elated her even further. However, unfortunately, their son was born with several health issues, and this in turn worried them, which of course was due to the nature of their unlawful immigration to the UK. So, later that year in 2008, Aliny and Ricardo decided it was best for them to move back to Brazil, mostly so their son could get the treatment he needed, all being away from any prying eyes or shady paperwork. Although their stay was supposed to be brief, the couple would end up spending several years back in Brazil. And during this time, Aliny gave birth to 2 more baby boys, the family growing healthily and, for the most part, happily. Aliny was in her element. Being a caring mother was what she had always wanted in life, and she assumed that parenthood was the same aspiration for Ricardo as well. But unfortunately, it seemed like the move back to Brazil was devastating for him. Upon returning, Ricardo would spiral into drug addiction, which obviously began to put strain on the relationship. And even more worryingly, it completely changed Ricardo's attitude toward Aliny. Aliny persevered through these struggles, but she did in fact worry that something bad would happen to Ricardo. After all, he was her partner and the father to their 3 children. But problems escalated when Ricardo began to abuse Aliny. And rightfully so, the two would split up, but only for a brief period. Aliny eventually accepted him back, but only if Ricardo promised to a clean and fresh start. You can probably guess that never happened. There had always been some form of abuse present throughout their relationship, but with the inclusion of drugs, it became much worse. And as is common in abusive relationships, Aliny stayed with Ricardo because of her children. She was worried what would happen to them and her if she left him. Aliny eventually agreed to stay with Ricardo, but under one condition: that they move back to London. Put quite simply, Brazil was just not adequately supporting their growing family, and so Ricardo agreed. The family of 5 made their way back to England in 2014, a whole 6 years since originally leaving, and now they were back with an additional 2 members. Although they headed back to pursue better opportunities, Aliny actually found it very difficult to find any work, as did Ricardo, and he was still taking drugs, and Aliny was still being abused. Their move back to the UK wasn't what Aliny had expected. Nevertheless, all friends that they left behind were elated to have them all back. Their long-term friend Vanessa and her husband even offered the family a place to stay until they got their feet off the ground. For the following 3 years, everything seemed normal from the outside. The couple cooked together, shared their care for the children, and also had cute pet names for each other. They even welcomed another addition to the family, their one and only baby daughter. And so, the household in Epsom grew, with Aliny, Ricardo, and their 4 children, along with Vanessa and her husband, residing under one roof. But behind closed doors, Ricardo was still abusing and manipulating Aliny, and the veil over their housemate's eyes would finally fall on one night in 2018. During the very early hours of the morning, Vanessa and her husband Henrique were asleep in their bed, when suddenly they heard Aliny scream in the living room. Vanessa jumped out of her bed, woke her husband up, and both of them rushed into the living room. They found Aliny in a panic, crouching on the sofa. Ricardo was stood several feet away from her, and it was obvious the two had been arguing. She claimed that the two were arguing when Ricardo jumped on her and started choking her. She was distraught by this, clearly devastated and scared. Although Ricardo was currently going through drug treatment, this apparently was quite a common occurrence. Whenever Aliny threatened to leave him, he would become physically violent towards her. Aliny finally realised that enough was enough, and she no longer wanted to be with Ricardo. But when would be the best time to leave, and how would she do it? She had 4 children to care for, so she couldn't just pack up and run. Aliny began to bide her time. She would put up with Ricardo for as long as she needed to, at least until her first opportunity would present itself. Since returning to the UK in 2014, Ricardo had actually built himself a small construction business, and surprisingly, his business had grown pretty well. But quite clearly, Ricardo had very little knowledge on finances and accounting, so Aliny stepped in to administrate the business financials for him. This was how their family gained their income. They relied on Ricardo's business doing well to keep them afloat. Again, Ricardo was out of touch with his accounts and profits, and taking an uneducated glance over his accounts, he thought he saw an error. To Ricardo, it seemed as though £37,000 were missing from his profits, and after this guess, he went straight to Aliny to confront her. He accused her of stealing his money and planning to leave him, and in his mind, she was already guilty of betrayal. It turns out that, actually, Aliny had done nothing wrong. Ricardo simply couldn't count. But unfortunately, his rage was as evident as his stupidity. By now, shit really had hit the fan for the couple, and although Aliny wanted to peacefully separate, Ricardo had other plans. Ricardo was extremely manipulative. He knew that Aliny wanted to leave him, so he tried to get her back through jealousy. He actually lied to Aliny by telling her that he was in a new relationship and wanted to marry another woman. He was actually expecting Aliny to beg him to stay, but this backfired on him massively, as instead she told him to hurry up with the divorce. Complications between the two peaked over Christmas of 2018. Their housemates, Vanessa and Henrique, had returned to Brazil for the holidays, leaving the empty house as a battleground for Ricardo to verbally and emotionally abuse Aliny without prying eyes. She had become so scared of him that she would lock herself in her room for as much as 24 hours at a time, calling on friends to come over while she left the room, just so she could feed and care for her children. Despite their shattered marriage, Ricardo didn't want Aliny to leave. He enjoyed the power that he had over her. However, he was aware that if she really wanted to go, she could flee England with the children at any time. So, to trap Aliny and stop that from happening, he shredded their children's passports in front of her. She told Ricardo that she was going to leave, but in response, he threatened to go to the Home Office to turn her in. Since the couple had gained access to the country via a fake marriage certificate, he had a way to gain leverage over her and legally threaten her. But even this threat wasn't enough to stop her, as on the 27th of December 2018, she confided to the police, reporting that she feared for her life and for her children's safety. And thankfully, her concerns were taken seriously, as police provided Aliny a safe house away from Ricardo. Aliny's inner circle of friends also organised a private group chat on WhatsApp, as a means to support Aliny should she ever need it. It was a pivotal moment in Aliny's life. Some encouraging progress was finally being made. Aliny slowly began to feel safer as she regained control to her life once again. However, very little did she know that Ricardo was scheming. After their separation, Ricardo found himself with a bunch of old stuff left by the family, and it's here that he stumbled across Aliny's old SIM card. After putting it into his own phone, he realised that he had access to all of Aliny's messages and emails, which were also connected to her current number. And, more crucially, it gave Ricardo full access to Aliny's WhatsApp support group. Without anyone even realising, he now had full awareness over Aliny, and this was hidden in plain sight. He now knew of her plans, where she was going, what she was doing, what she was saying, and even what she was thinking through her messages. And even worse, he could now track Aliny at all times using the Find My iPhone feature. Just by logging into Aliny's iCloud, Ricardo could see where she was at any time of day. And this is where Ricardo's repertoire of abusive behaviour added stalking to the mix. He wasn't going to let her go peacefully. In fact, over the next month, Ricardo would eventually track down Aliny at her safe house. And after finding exactly where she lived, he attempted to break in twice, both times resulting in his arrest. Due to his arrest, Child Protective Services would eventually intervene, and as a direct result, Ricardo was only allowed to see his children under supervised circumstances. Ricardo would see this as a final breach to his power and ownership over Aliny. If she exclusively had his children, then he had lost. He once again lost his temper, and he started to make threats against her life. Aliny was urged by friends to take these messages to the police, but being one who wished to avoid conflict, she decided not to, and instead, she hoped that Ricardo would loosen up and move on. Aliny was aware that she was in a very dangerous place with Ricardo, but nevertheless, she believed that he would never do anything in front of the children, so as long as she was with them, she was safe. She began to take her 3-year-old daughter everywhere she went, whether that was shopping, running errands, or even to pick up her older boys from school, despite childcare always being available. Every weekday, she would journey from her temporary housing in London out to the suburb of Epsom to take her young boys to school and back. And it was during this typical journey to school that Ricardo would one day snap. February the 8th, 2019. It was winter in the United Kingdom, and England was doing what it does best. That's rain, wind, and a lowly temperature of 8 degrees Celsius, or 46 Fahrenheit. Aliny woke to get the boys ready for school. She couldn't drive, so her round trip from central London to Epsom would happen twice each day. The morning progressed like any other. Aliny waved goodbye to her sons at the gate, promising to see them later when school was over. And meanwhile, not far from the school, Ricardo had also started his day like any other, leaving his house on Kingston Road to begin work. Only today, he would take an extra tool with him. Ricardo had a few jobs that morning. One job taking him to Hawley, and then another to Chertsey. And once complete, he refueled his black pickup truck at a petrol station, where a surveillance camera captured his movements. It is now the early afternoon, and Aliny was on her way back to Epsom to pick up her boys, again taking her 3-year-old daughter along with her. Using the tube out from central London, the two boarded their usual bus stop in Epsom at 2:38 p.m, Aliny heading to the back of the bus to let her daughter sit down. And only 7 minutes later, they alighted from the bus stop, the mother holding her daughter's hand as they departed together. However, unknown to them or anyone else, while driving further down the A45, surveillance cameras captured a black pickup truck pulling out of a side road. The truck then turns towards the direction of Aliny and her daughter, and this is where the situation gets gruesome. Through the bus's surveillance camera, you can just about see that the pickup truck mounted onto the pavement in front of Aliny and a group of mothers. And coming out of this truck emerged Ricardo. His face remained emotionless and he was silent, and in his hand, his extra work tool for the day. It was a knife, taken from the kitchen that they once shared together. Dread washed over Aliny. She let out a small sharp scream, but it was too late. Ricardo sprung onto her, pulled back the knife, and began to stab her multiple times. As the other mothers looked on in horror, they recalled no emotion to Ricardo's face. He was calm, collected, and focused. The attack consisted of 7 strikes, lasting for only 17 seconds. And when he was done, Ricardo dropped the weapon, got back in his pickup truck, and sped away. The distraught mothers around Aliny immediately called 999 for an ambulance and police. Tony Miller, the mother who pulled Aliny's daughter to safety, tried to shield her to what had just happened. But it was a wasted effort, as the 3-year-old saw it all. Looking up to Mrs. Miller, she said, "Mummy's not coming back." An ambulance and police would arrive just moments later, but tragically, Aliny would be pronounced dead on arrival. Following the assault, Ricardo made several calls to his friends and employees, confessing that he had just stabbed his wife. His truck was stopped by police just an hour and a half after the attack, where, obviously, he was then arrested before being charged with first-degree murder. He was also given an additional charge of possession of an offensive weapon in a public place. Appearing at Guildford Crown Court, his trial began on the 1st of July 2019. And, no surprise to his type of personality, Ricardo would deny all forms of abuse. He also claimed that he was stressed at the time of murdering Aliny, and he apparently had no idea what he was doing. Allegedly, he had no desire to kill her. He simply flew into an uncontrollable rage after not being able to see his children. He would, however, plead guilty to a lesser charge of manslaughter, but he denied murder or possession of an offensive weapon in a public place. Witnesses at the scene came forward to recall their experience, as did Ricardo's friends and employees whom he called after the crime. Mutual friends would also recall the abuse and trauma that Ricardo inflicted against his very own girlfriend, and how over time, Aliny had become a frightened and nervous soul at the mercy of a vile and callous man. The outcome of Ricardo's trial is a no-brainer. Ricardo Godinho was unanimously found guilty of the murder of Aliny Godinho. He was sentenced to life on the 18th of July 2019, and was given a minimum sentence of 27 years before being eligible for parole. Ricardo's attack showed the very worst of humanity. His actions permanently took the mother of his own children away from them, and consequently left them without a father too. And this wasn't one swift movement either. He had inflicted so much stress and anxiety to the one he was supposed to love. Ricardo was selfish, possessive, manipulative. He refused to face the consequences of his own actions, and to him, Revenge was more important than the life of his long-term lover, and in the end, even more important than his own life. May he rot in prison for the rest of it. Aliny was lost to the world way too early, and although she has left a hole in the hearts of many friends and family, what is more apparent is the ever-cascading void her absence has created in the hearts of her 3 sons and young daughter. Aliny's children meant everything to her, and she was described by others as warm, giving and hospitable. And I know it's perceived as cliché to say, but Aliny was genuinely a lovely person. Even in formality, the judge described her as kind, generous, optimistic, and loved. From caring for her siblings at a young age, through to her work in hospitality, to gaining a large and supportive group of friends in a foreign country, it was evident that Aliny was a bright and loving individual. But no matter the depth of love that she had and wanted to give, she wouldn't receive a fraction of it back from the man that she wanted it from so dearly. Thank you so much for watching another video today by Coffeehouse Crime. If you found this video interesting, or you learned something new today, then please remember to like the video and subscribe if you haven't yet. Another case in England, and another case centered around love and a poor excuse of a man. I think I'll be taking a break from England for a while, and I've got very different types of cases coming in the next few weeks, so look out for those. Thank you again for watching, folks, and I'll see you again real soon in the next one. Until that moment arrives though, look after each other. Goodbye.